This will be very helpful for us since we're working budgets today. But thank you, Eddie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. What I'm presenting today is the State General Fund revenue estimates, consensus revenue estimates, the long memo. You received a copy of that in your packet. I believe one of the days last week. If it is still there, that's great. If not, I believe John does have some extra copies because I am going to be presenting from that memo. It is a memo that has our letterhead on it, but it's a joint memo from our office and from the Division of the Budget to the Governor and the Legislative Coordinating Council. It is dated November 21st, 2025. And this is what we refer to as the long memo. For a little bit of background information, Kansas uses a consensus revenue estimating process, which basically just means that the legislature and the governor agree on what the underlying numbers are as it relates to the state's revenues. Statutorily, we do that process twice a year. We do it once in the spring in April, once in the fall. The statutory deadline for that fall estimate is actually December 4th. Typically, we do that estimate sometime right around Veterans Day, though, as a practical matter. We've kind of discovered that we don't really learn all that terribly much about state receipts between November 10th-ish and December 4th. And because of the Thanksgiving holiday, trying to schedule it right then is more problematic than it's worth. So early November is when we do it. The spring estimate by law has to be done on April 20th. And we are learning lots about state receipts, sometimes maybe more noise than signal, though, in that time frame in April, because that's, of course, right around tax filing day, and there's a lot of money coming into the state's coffers by virtue of those last-minute tax payments every day in that time frame. And so we are learning a lot, and accordingly, in the spring, we always do the meeting either on April 20th or the nearest business day to April 20th. And so what we're going to go over today is the revisions that we made to the FY 2026 estimate in November, as well as the initial estimate for FY 2027. As a group, statutorily we are required to estimate the current year and one following fiscal year. And so we do the initial estimate for the following fiscal year in November of the year before every year. That estimate is then revised 3 times before the end of the year, once in April of that fiscal year, a second time in November of the following fiscal year, and then a final time in April of that particular fiscal year. So this estimate is the second revision to the FY 2026 estimate and the initial estimate for FY 2027. The long memo contains a lot of detail on the economic forecast and a number of other, hopefully, informational items within that, but I'm going to primarily present today the numbers to you, and those numbers are in the tables that are at the back of the memo. And so Table 1 contains the actual receipts for FY 2025, as well as the revised estimate for FY 2026 and the initial estimate for FY 2027. Table 2 shows the specific revisions to the FY 2026 numbers, and I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between both of those two tables as we go today. But to start out, we're going to talk about the bottom line numbers. For FY 2026 on Table 2 at the bottom line, literally, you can see that we increased the estimate by $165.9 million from $10.06 billion to $10.23 billion. This increase of $165.9 million probably shouldn't be too surprising, as through the month of October we were a little more than $103 million ahead of the estimates, and so that's exactly a third of the year in terms of calendar, a little less than a third of the year in terms of the state's receipts. For FY 2027, bouncing back to Table 1 at the bottom line, you can see that our initial estimate was $10.13 billion, which is an decrease of about $94 million, or 0.9% relative to this newly revised FY 2026 estimate. However, I want to note that forecasted decline is essentially attributable to policy items, not economic conditions. And I'll go through a number of those policy items in more detail here in just a minute. However, I do want to pause at this moment and draw your attention to a line that is just about a little bit, maybe a quarter of the page above that total receipts line, and highlight the total taxes line. You can see on that total taxes line we have growth from $10.0 billion to 10.1 billion to 10.24 billion across this forecast period. And I want to draw your attention to that total taxes line because this is the tax committee. And while the SGF receipts do include some non-tax items, the total tax line is probably a better line for this committee to look at. And probably also if you're thinking about the way receipts are coming in and are we meeting our expectations? Are our receipts growing? The total tax line is probably a more appropriate place to look because of the fact that those other revenues have a lot of factors that feed into them that aren't necessarily reflective of economic conditions or the state's tax policies. I'm going to describe that. The net transfers, for instance, you can see that we have negative $503 million in FY25 of actuals. Then it goes to negative $208.4 million in FY26 estimates, and then bounces back up to negative $440.9 million in FY 2027. Total transfers in and out of the state general fund are generally reflective of policy decisions that you all make, and so those can kind of throw extra noise that isn't necessarily reflective of things into the total receipts picture. A few years ago, you all transferred I say you all, I mean the legislature collectively at that point in time, transferred over the course of a couple of years a little over $1.1 billion into the KPERS Trust Fund and over $1 billion as well into the Budget Stabilization Fund. Those transfers show up as negatives in that line, and they make it appear as though the state's receipts are less than they actually are because the state general fund receipts are less than they otherwise would have been. But that's just moving it from one state fund to another. When you want to get to what the actual experience of taxpayers are, that total taxes line can sometimes tell a lot more complete story because it doesn't have that policy noise in it. So, circling back to those key policy items that I do want to specifically highlight, I'm going to highlight 4 of those before I get into the individual source estimates. The first of those is federal tax law changes pursuant to HR 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That reduced the total estimate by about $60 million in FY 2026 and about $140 million in FY 2027 relative to what it would have been but for that enactment of federal law. The largest pieces of that were that certain expensing and bonus depreciation provisions in the federal law that carry through to Kansas taxes by way of conformity had been phasing downwards prior to that law pursuant to the 2017 federal tax law. The law enacted last summer by the federal government reinstated those to 100% and set them at that level on an ongoing basis. And so they had been trickling downwards and they were reinstated to 100%. So that results in reduced state receipts in the near term pursuant to that. However, I want to highlight that those are just accelerations of that depreciation. And so those are deductions that businesses were going to be able to take at some point. And what the federal law did was shift that money, those deductions, into the kind of the immediate and near term, as opposed to where they would have been on a longer term basis. So that's kind of shifting when that receipt happens. It has the benefit for businesses of kind of the time value of money and the immediate depreciation of that. But for the state's purposes, those deductions were going to happen at some point in time. This just accelerates when they were going to happen. So kind of in the long term, those sorts of policies have no net effect but for the time value of money. Another provision within that law was the creation of a similar sort of expensing provision for certain research and development expenses. Once again, that just accelerates the impact of those expenses. The child and dependent care tax credit, which the state adopts by way of partial conformity, 1% of the federal tax credit, was also increased at the federal level, and so that did also have a negative impact to state receipts because the taxpayers who utilize that credit will be able to have a larger federal tax credit, which converts to a larger state tax credit. There were a number of other provisions in that federal law. They were all relative to those ones much smaller and kind of came out in the wash. So the next policy item that I want to highlight for you is the Apex tax credit that was enacted by the 2022 legislature. And that is a tax credit that is an investment tax credit for the Apex agreement, which Panasonic was the company that the state entered into an Apex agreement with. We anticipate the amount of that tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit, increasing by about $50 million this year relative to last year, and then again by another about $50 million next year relative to this year. That's a tax credit that is is refundable, but the amount is divided up into fifths. So for each year's investment by the company, they divide that into 5 portions, equal portions. They take a fifth of it each year for the next 5 succeeding years. And so last year, we saw the first impact of that to state receipts. This year is kind of the next step up in terms of the impact on that to state receipts. Next year will be the third, and we anticipate final step up. And then it will level off at that point for about 3 years. And then the first years will drop off. The year after that, the second years will drop off. And then by 2031, the state's apex hit to receipts, so to speak, should be fully resolved. The third policy item that I want to draw your attention to is the elimination of the state property taxes. Last year, the legislature eliminated the state's 1.5 mils of state property taxes. And to clarify, and I've made this note several times in the last few weeks, speaking with legislators, if you've received questions from your constituents who got their tax bills in December saying, I thought last summer you told me you eliminated the 1.5 mil property tax levy, but I just got a tax bill and it's still on there. They are correct, and you were correct. You eliminated that prospectively, and when they received their tax bills in December of 2025, those were the tax bills for tax year 2025. The elimination of that mill levy was effective for tax year 2026. And so the bill they got in December is the last time they will pay that bill absent further statutory change. And they'll pay, half of it in December, half of it when they make their second half payment in May. When they get their bills next December for tax year 2026, it won't have that levy on it. But anyway, that property tax elimination, part of that bill, you also replaced the revenue to those 2 state funds which would have received that property tax proceeds, the Educational Building Fund and the State Institutions Building Fund, with transfers from the State General Fund. And so the transfers, the net transfers line, I drew your attention to that earlier. This year, it's anticipated to be $298.4 million out of the general fund in net to other funds, and next year that goes up to $440.9 million. That's an increase of $142.9 million. $81 million of that is attributable to those transfers to those 2 building funds because of the state's property tax elimination. And then the last item that I want to draw your attention to is also in that total transfers line, and I'm just kind of describing it as the reinstatement of other transfers. FY 2026 saw transfers to either the Build Kansas Infrastructure Matching Grant Fund and also a higher education deferred maintenance fund either be reduced because the demand for them was not what was previously anticipated, or financed with non-SGF sources. And beginning in FY 2027, those go back to their full statutory amounts and full SGF financing. And so that is about $70 million of increased transfers out of the state general fund in FY 2027 relative to FY 2026, which also accounts for part of that big increase out. So with all of that being said, I'll now, I can either stay in for questions on those or start talking about some specific tax sources, so whatever the committee would prefer.
We'll ask for questions.
Okay.
Thanks, Eddie. I do have a question. Would you mind emailing the committee the numbers on the Apex bill, what we're looking at, and how much the state will be writing a check for, basically?
So how much the amount of that tax credit that is to be refunded to the taxpayer, that's actually confidential pursuant to taxpayer confidentiality laws. But we can provide the estimate for what the total impact of that would be over time.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions, committee? Senator Owen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Eddie, thanks for this. This is always fascinating to know. So I realize we do the estimates in November. Can you tell me how December played out and how that compared to what we expected?
Sure, yeah, I'll talk both November and December. Since
okay.
The November monthly amounts were almost exactly on par with our expectations, and not really any news to report as it relates to that. December, we did miss the estimate by, I think, about $57 million in total across all sources. That was distributed across a number of tax sources. We were behind on individual, corporate, sales, and use. The sales and use appear to just be a little sluggish relative to the estimate, just in the sense that consumers, December receipts are reflective of November transactions. Consumers just didn't seem to spend as much as we anticipated they would. And with the month of November and December, which translate into receipts in December and January, of course, there's always the question of, is this an actual decline in the consumption in that holiday shopping season relative to our expectations, or is this just a shift in timing within that holiday shopping season? And so we'll have a lot better picture of that next week when we publish the January receipts. I think at this point that it's going to reflect that it was a cooler holiday shopping season than we anticipated. Obviously, that will bear close attention of, is that a general cooling of the economy, or is that just the holiday season? And so we'll be paying close attention to that in coming months as we look towards revising these estimates in April. On the individual and corporate side of things, the corporate piece of that, I think, was largely a timing issue. December is a quarterly estimated payment for corporations on a typical basis, but also those SALT parity taxpayers from 2022 legislation, they tend to make a payment right at the end of the month of December, because that's when, for business purposes, they're able to deduct it when they're doing their following year's receipts, when they're finalizing their business expenses for the year. And accordingly, when they make that payment right in the last week of December, some of that, just by virtue of when it gets to the state, gets receipted in the month of December, and some of that gets receipted in the month of January. And so I think we're going to make up some of that miss in December in the month of January by virtue of just more of that spilling over into the month of January than we anticipated. It's an imprecise science splitting it up into the monthly estimates is the reality of it. On individual, it was reflective of much weaker withholding than we anticipated. One of my comments on the individual income tax as a source, I mean, it's going to primarily focus on the fact that we didn't have a good explanation for withholding. It had been growing very rapidly for a number of months at a much more rapid rate than, frankly, we could explain well with the underlying economic growth. December was somewhat of a reversion on that, and sometimes with withholding, that can also be timing. It can be, employers got payments in right at the end of the month of November, or they're going to pay a little bit more in the month of January, and so it just hits us that 1 month. And the reality is it's too early to say on that. But we do have our eye, what we're closely watching as we move towards the April estimates. Mm-hmm.
Madam
Senator
Chair,
Owens.
yeah, thank you. I find this information so incredibly pertinent to decisions that we're making in the budget today. So if I could request that either we have Eddie back for a brief update once we get those January numbers, or if you could send something out that further clarifies many of the things you just thought about, that would just help us, I think, make better decisions.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Schellenberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Does a retailer, Walmart, when they submit their sales tax, they have to do that weekly, daily, monthly?
Sales taxes are, for most retailers, reported on a monthly basis at this point, and it's generally with a 1-month lag. Smaller retailers might only have to do it on a quarterly or annual basis. So,
So if I'm buying something from Amazon, I know that they collect sales tax now. Do they do it the same way?
Yeah, assuming that they exceed the total sales threshold to be monthly remitters, which without having seen the actual tax returns, not working for the department, I feel confident saying that Amazon does.
Thank you.
Thank you. Eddie, also, we're going to run into a little bit of problem since session's going to finish before April. We won't have April numbers, which we usually do to adjust the budget. So that's going to be interesting for our Ways and Means Committee. But go ahead.
Yeah, that might, to Senator Owens' point, that might speak to some of the value of paying especially close attention to those monthly kind of status reports. Now, obviously, all that being said, the monthly reports themselves are not new estimates, but if you're finishing before estimating day, that's probably the best you've got. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and that does. I think I heard you mention looking at the trends. It does speak what you'll want to look at on that is if we're going back and forth. A good month, a bad month, a good month, a bad month. In that case, it's probably just a timing issue, and you probably shouldn't read too much into it. But if we have month after month after month after month of being all the time on one side of the estimate, whether that's positive or negative, unless you have a good explanation why, you probably ought to expect that's the direction the estimate would be revised. Yeah. So moving back to some specific tax sources. For individual income tax, and this is on table 1, you can see that we have change year over year from 25 to 26, anticipating 5.8% growth, and then in 27, further 3.2% growth. That current year at 5.8% is a little bit hard to explain. We expect nominal GDP growth of about 4.8% for the calendar year. Calendar 25 over 24, which is the biggest driver for 26 over 25 receipts. However, through the first 4 months of the year, withholding taxes were up 11% relative to the prior year, and through the month of November, they were in pretty good shape as well. I don't remember the exact percent. And this is what I referred to earlier, that it's kind of a difficult circle to square as it relates to why are withholding taxes growing so well if the economy is growing 4.8%, which 4.8% is fine, but it's certainly not 11%. And so when we made this estimate, we kind of all had an understanding that if those withholding taxes continue to grow at that 11% clip, this estimate's too low. If those withholding estimates immediately revert back to such a way where the year in total is going to be more like 4.8%, then this estimate is too high. And so we kind of, as you can see, we have 5.8%. So more or less we're anticipating the tapering off down to the full year amounts, but also maybe some of that gets returned back to taxpayers in the form of higher return refunds when we get into filing season. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty there, but the FY27 3.2% growth is kind of more in line with our economic expectations. Corporation income taxes, you can see we have sharp declines in both years, 169 million or 12.8% in the current year, and then 105 million or 9.2% next year. That is the policy items that I talked about. You might remember both the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and the Apex provisions were going to have the effect of reducing state receipts, and by and large, that shows up in that corporation line of the income of the receipts. However, it's also worth noting, and I've noted this in other presentations of this memo, that the corporation income tax receipts are now a mix of C corporations and pass-through entities. The pass-through entities through November had been pretty stable, and the weakness that we had seen had really been on the C Corp side of the economy. We had wondered if that is related to tariff policy kind of, and not only tariff policy, but also the way that businesses are dealing with tariff policy. If they are kind of absorbing the costs of those tariffs themselves, it would serve to reduce corporation income tax receipts. If it comes to pass that they tend to start passing more of those on to their consumers, then at that point they would have larger receipts themselves, and this should bounce back, but that would presumably have somewhat of an inflationary impact within the economy, and so that might feed through to other tax sources. Financial institutions privilege tax and insurance premiums tax, I'm going to lump these two together for purposes of commentary. You can see a decline anticipated in the current year on privilege tax from about 49 million down to 43 million. And then insurance premiums tax, only 2.7% growth when I think most consumers have seen their insurance premiums climb by more than 2.7% over the last year. And so you might be wondering why the downturn on the privilege tax and why the tepid growth on the premiums tax. This is one where the utilization of tax credits is driving the receipts more so than the underlying economy in these sectors. Over recent years, the legislature has either enacted or expanded a number of tax credits, certain housing credits, certain historic preservation credits. These are two sectors of the economy, two industries that have been pretty forthcoming, but the fact that they have been some of the primary utilizers of those credits. And so within the forecast period, kind of the growth of receipts within those two tax sources is kind of being driven by the utilization of those tax credits, and that's kind of where you're seeing some of those flow through into the tax receipts. And then the other thing that I wanted to highlight is the sales and use taxes. You can kind of see the impacts of the food sales tax policy and the completion of that phase out within the receipts. You can see that FY25 receipts on the sales tax side were negative 3.6%. We're imagining negative 1.6 this year and growth of 2% next year on sales. That is in essence food. The negative 3.6% last year, you remember that's a full year of the rate being 2% lower than it was previously. This year at negative 1.6% is a half year of the rate being 2% lower than it was previously, because in the fall of 25, of course, there was still 2% of tax on food, and now we've got a full year of 0%. But beginning next year, we're kind of back to what we think of as steady state with those two taxes. And because FY27, the tax base should be the same, absent, legislative action by you all this year. It should be the same for the entire fiscal year as it is for the entirety of fiscal year 26. And so for future years, those growth rates of 2% and something between 3 and 4%, netting out to maybe somewhere between 2.25% and 2.5% for the taxes combined is what we kind of think we should expect. So that's kind of the only thing that I have to say about any specific tax source. I do want to note that last year the legislature enacted SB 269, which provides for kind of formulaic rate reductions to individual corporation and financial institutions taxes based upon the growth in receipts above an inflation-adjusted FY 2024 baseline. So collectively, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group, every time we meet now, is going to do a check to see, do our expectations contemplate that the growth in those receipts exceeding the baseline. And I just want to let everybody know, and we want to be as transparent as we can, in our forecast as it relates to this, we don't anticipate within this forecast period any rate reductions to occur attributable to that policy. And so these all assume that the rates will continue to be the same, which if you look at the total amount of receipts there and compare it to FY24 and our inflation expectations, you would see that those are still below that kind of an inflation-adjusted baseline. And so that's kind of all I have to say on the topic, and would happily stand for whatever additional questions the committee may have.
Any questions? So Eddie, on your sales tax estimates, does that take into account the Star Bonds projects?
So do you mean specifically the stadium project? No, these estimates were made on November 13th. You can see the date of the table, and the Star Bond project was announced December 22nd. The state is still kind of waiting on the exact specifics of exactly what that district will be and when that will take effect. Obviously, going forward, to the extent that district includes territory outside of the development itself, we will kind of look very closely and carefully at what that district boundary is, because if it includes the increment outside of the development, then that would have the effect of suppressing sales tax growth rates that are attributable to that geography. Whatever fraction of the state's total growth that geography is attributable to would kind of reduce sales tax growth by that amount. And so we'll look closely at that, but at this point, there's no specifics.
Thank you, Eddie. Any way you guys could take a guesstimate at it and get us maybe a worst case and a best case scenario?
We're kind of looking at that. Because of the uncertainty of the geography, it's kind of impossible to say what the worst case and the best case would be. If you were to draw the district such that it captured all of the possible growth and none of the possible decline within those geographies, then obviously you could get very different outcomes than if you drew it in depending upon other sets of assumptions. So it's kind of the number of possibilities for those district boundaries make it such that it's kind of impossible to establish exactly what the best case and worst case for SGF receipts would be necessarily.
I was just curious about a percentage maybe that it might impact us so that we can be aware. Senator Klump.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Eddie. You talk about a softening, a potential softening due to maybe tariffs or other things on the corporate side, C Corps.
Mm-hmm.
Do we do any reach out to current C Corps to try and gain an assessment, whether that's once or twice a year? Or do you have a process that go ahead.
So yeah, as background for the consensus revenue estimating process, while the statute says the consensus is an agreement between the Director of Legislative Research, Shirley Morrow, on behalf of the legislature, and the Director of the Budget, Adam Profit, on behalf of the executive branch. as a practical matter, of course, the process is a lot more complicated than that. And we, of course, have tremendous involvement from the Department of Revenue. We also contract with 3 consulting economists, one from each of the 3 research universities within the state. And those economists, we ask them to be in touch with specific sectors and specific geographies to get a sense of their expectations within that. And so we do get input from them kind of by virtue of their contacts and communications within those sectors is kind of the way that we've handled that.
Madam Chair. That's very helpful. On those, their opinions that are provided, are those available for review, or is that just built into your overall opinion?
Yeah, those are just baked into the estimate. They're not available for review.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator? No other questions? Okay.
And it looks like my timing was perfect. as Jacob
Perfect.
just got here. Yeah.
Thank you, Eddie. Jacob, you're up. Sorry, we didn't let you get too comfortable there. Which budget would you like to start with? Let's start with BODA.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Jacob Klesby. I'm the fiscal analyst from the Kansas Legislative Research Department assigned to the Board of Tax Appeals. As a brief refresher of the budget document, if you will turn to page 2 of the KLRD budget summary, you will see a budget policy in snapshot. This highlights the major changes suggested by the agency outside of the approved amount. If you'll notice, in fiscal year 2026, there's $7,000 of SGF reappropriation. And I do apologize to the committee. Going up the stairs from the 1st to the 5th floor is the most cardio I've done in a month, so I'm out of breath at the moment. And then if you look to 2027, the agency had 2 enhancement requests, one for 3 new FTE positions, which totaled $207,000. The agency has adjusted this request, removing the position of the taxpayer advocate, and the final amount is $104,000. And a market rate adjustment of $33,000 to adjust the salaries of existing staff attorneys. If you will turn to page 9 of the document on fiscal year 2026, outside of the enhancements and reappropriations requested by the agency, there was a request for BODA modernization, which was $117,000 of ARPA spending. Turning to page 10 of the document, the only other change requested outside of the enhancements in fiscal year 2027 was $42,000 of operating expenditures. I'm happy to stand for questions or hear the committee's recommendations.
Thank you, committee. What was the recommendations you were going to?
Oh, Madam Chair, the committee hasn't made any recommendations. I was saying that I'm either happy to stand for questions or hear the committee's recommendations on the budget.
Okay, committee, I'll start out with the first recommendation, and believe me, this is an odd one for a conservative, but I do appreciate the Board of Tax Appeals trying to come in below their budget, and there was approximately $6,000 withdrawn because they had stayed below the budget. I think we shouldn't punish them, and so I would recommend that we add that money back. If there's, Senator Clump.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would you like a motion or would you like a second?
Make the motion, that'd be great.
I move, so let me get my language right. Thank you, Madam Chair. I move that we readjust the SGF reappropriation of $6,907 back into the budget.
For Board of Tax Appeals. Okay, it's been moved by Senator Clump, seconded by Senator Peterson. Discussion on the motion. Senator Schallenberger.
So I'm just trying to catch up through all my paper. How much money was that?
Senator Clump.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It was just over $6,900.
$6,900?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Any further discussion on the motion? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we certainly want agencies to work within their budget and hopefully under their budget. But if this money is being appropriated again next year in the budget, right, included in that, then in some ways, we could be building up a fund, and I'm not sure why.
Senator Francisco, I have heard that there is going to be language for helping and trying to handle this scenario, but I just feel like it sends the wrong message that we are trying to get agencies and departments to save money. And they are in need of more resources, couple of staff, personnel, and this might help them. I know they've ran into some other obligations. It's less than $7,000. But I know every penny is important up here, very important. So if you would substitute motions in order, or we could dispose of this motion and you can make another motion.
I'm not objecting to it. I'm just trying to understand what our policy is going to be because it's been different in different committees. So I appreciate the fact that there may be an overall change to how this is addressed.
Yes. I think there will be, since we have several Ways and Means people on this committee. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Any other changes or recommendations? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I do have a question of staff on the page 9 ARPA money. Do they need authorization for that expenditure? Do they need authorization to spend that money, or what would happen to it if we don't authorize? Is it automatic?
Madam Chair, to address Senator Peck's question, the agency does need authorization to spend this money. These ARPA dollars are federal funds that are currently already held by the agency. They were not spent last year by the conclusion of the ARPA program, but they were allocated, so they have until the remainder of the year to spend those funds. If those funds were not spent by the agency, they would return to the federal government.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. On page 9, the agency tells us the amount, $117,000, and what they would use it for. This would be a one-time investment in hardware, software upgrades, database management, et cetera. And because of the fact that it is ARPA money that the federal government decided to send out to states, and my understanding is it must be spent, not just encumbered, but actually out the door by September of this year, I would, and you're going with motions, so I would make a motion that we authorize the agency to spend this money for the purpose that they indicated on page 9. I say they, this is a budget summary, but I would guess that the budget summary wasn't just made up, it was probably the agency's request. So that would be that $117,161 of ARPA money.
Do we have a second on the motion? I'll second it. Okay, Senator Peterson. It's been moved by Senator Peck, seconded by Senator Peterson. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Any other recommendations? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The agency did ask for the 2 new FTE positions. I was very pleased to hear the discussion about the taxpayer advocate, but I think it would be appropriate to request the funds for the legal assistant and the administrative assistant. So I'd make that recommendation.
Is there a second on the motion? Okay, it's been moved by Senator Francisco, seconded by Senator Corson. Discussion on the motion. And I'll lead off with, I understand the need for the individuals, and I will support the motion. However, I would like a statement with the budget recommendation that they consider or continue to look for more. I know that there's software and systems out there that could increase their efficiencies, And I would encourage that instead of always continuing with staff. So, but I understand that this is a fire, they could probably use both the software and the individuals right now with the load that they have. Senator Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How many open FTE do they have right now?
Madam Chair, the agency is entirely staffed at the moment, so they have no vacant FTE positions.
Thank you.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Clarification on the motion. So the agency had requested 3 new government employees, but the motion is for 1, and that would be for 2. So they removed their request. Their original request was 3. They dropped it down to 2. So this is to meet their, okay, I don't support additional state workers at this time. So I'm not going to support this, but I will make a comment. The agency requested some state general fund money for these positions. If this committee does determine that they want to add additional state employees, I would suggest that rather than the salary coming from state general fund, partially from state general fund, that it come entirely from the filing fee fund. So that's just something I thought I would throw out. Again, not going to make a motion because I'm not going to support this motion, but I might if these positions are approved. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In addition to your including the comments about the software, I think it would be appropriate to ask the board to review their fee schedule. That's not something that they would be able to do, I don't think, before next year, but we could ask them to review their fee schedule and look at the possibility of providing funds for these positions within their fees.
Would you like to include that in your motion?
I would.
Okay, with the second? Okay, so we will include that in the motion also. And discussion on that change. I've had heartburn for years over the fact that you have to pay to appeal your property taxes. I would love to get them off of a fee schedule, but I understand that's where we're at now, and we've attempted to make that change. It's just not something that's happening quickly. So, any further discussion?
Madam Chair, may I ask a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
So to clarify Senator Francisco's motion to review the fee schedule, are you referring to proviso language or just action to be taken by the agency?
I'm asking for the agency to review their fee schedule.
Did that clarify for you?
Yes, thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? No. The chair is in doubt. Division. All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, nay. It's a tie. Motion fails for a tie.
Madam Chair, for further discussion, I do have the General Government Budget Committee's recommendations, and as of the committee I just left from, the House Appropriations recommendations for 27 as well, if you would like me to brief the committee on that.
Yes.
Yes. So for fiscal year 2026, the General Government Budget Committee, chaired by Representative Wassinger, and the House Appropriations, chaired by Representative Waymaster, concurred with the LBC and maintained the deletion of the reappropriations, but made no other changes to fiscal year 2026. For fiscal year 2027, the General Government Budget Committee and the House Appropriations concurred with the addition of 2 additional FTEs, but not the addition of the market rate adjustments. But they also have concurred with the operating expenditures under line item 3. The governor's recommendation for fiscal year 2026, she reinstated the reappropriations, but did not concur with the enhancements in fiscal year 2027.
Thank you. Committee, any other recommendations on this budget? Seeing none. Oh, Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering if you might feel that either the legal assistant or the administrative assistant might be best replaced with software, and if we could make a recommendation for one, and I would ask you to choose.
Actually, the software I'm thinking of could help with both positions, so, and I don't want to drive them on any given system, but there are systems out there for legal, and they would help with the administrative process. So, did you want that in the,
I would make a recommendation that we include the $53,878 dollars in the budget, but let the choice of whether it's a legal assistant or administrative assistant be made by the agency.
is there a second on the motion? It's been moved by Senator Francisco, seconded by Senator Corson. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay? No. Motion fails. Sorry, nice try. What's your wishes on this budget committee? Do you want to make the motion? Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would move that the Student Assessment and Taxation Committee pass the budget recommendation for the Board of Tax Appeals as, well, as recommended by the committee, I guess, to the full Ways and Means Committee.
Thank you, Senator. Is it seconded by Senator Schallenberger? Moved by Senator Peck, seconded by Senator Schallenberger. Discussion, Senator Schallenberger.
Thank you. So what's the bottom line? Can somebody just tell me where?
Madam Chair, Senator Schallenberger, for fiscal year 2027, or would you also like me to re-examine 2026?
Both.
Both, okay. For fiscal year 2026, this committee has recommended that the SGF reappropriations of $6,907 be reinstated and concurred with the other legislative budget committees on the approval of the ARPA spending. For fiscal year 2027, this agency is concurring with the Legislative Budget Committee's recommendation to remove both enhancement requests for new FTE positions and respective market rate adjustments.
Is there a number associated with that? I'm sorry.
Yes. The adjusted enhancement request from the agency for new FTE positions, it is 2 FTE positions at $104,000, featuring $57,000 SGF. And then the market rate adjustments is $33,000 of featuring $18,000 of SGF.
Thank you.
That's not our recommendation, though, from this committee. The committee did not recommend the 2 FTEs.
Oh, my apologies, Madam Chair. I was referring to the removal of the 2 FTE positions as stated as what was removed.
Okay.
So removal of both enhancement requests. My apologies.
I misunderstood, so thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Any other questions? Okay, committee, we're finished with the BOTA budget, and my apologies to Revenue. Thank you for being here. We didn't vote. I'm sorry. Just thought we'd send it out with a second and a first. All those in favor of passing the budget favorably to the Ways and Means Committee, say aye. Aye. Okay. All those opposed, nay? Would you like to be recorded? Okay. Motion passes. So we have passed the BOTA budget, and I apologize to Revenue. I thought we would be able to get to it today. We will pick it up Tuesday. We'll make our adjustment to the schedule. And is there any other business to be brought before us? Seeing none, we're